Before Pearl Harbor, America and Great Britain agreed that should they find themselves at war with both Germany and Japan, the strategy would be Germany first. At the Arcadia Conference in Washington, beginning at the end of December 1941, there was broad agreement on this strategy, but the devil was in the details. Meetings of the combined chiefs of staff, the military service heads for Great Britain and the United States, grew difficult as they fought over where to engage the Nazis. Meanwhile, Churchill and Roosevelt met daily for their own discussions. The chiefs always hated that because they didn't know what Roosevelt and Churchill would get up to. Churchill had a reputation as an adventurer, and they were afraid he would sell Roosevelt on these wild schemes, and then the chiefs would have to either talk him out of it or, even worse, execute them. The U.S. Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, was the architect of American strategy for the European theater. He was a starchy descendant of an old Virginia family, a man of enormous probity. Near the end of his first meeting with the president in late 1938, FDR turned to the newly made Deputy Chief of Staff and said, "George, don't you think so?" Marshall shot back, "Mr. President, I don't agree with that at all." With a startled look on his face, Roosevelt abruptly adjourned the meeting. Attendees told Marshall they were sorry his career had ended so abruptly. Marshall later observed, "I remember he called me George. I wasn't very enthusiastic over his misrepresentation of our intimacy. I don't think he ever did it again." Marshall was convinced Germany must be confronted in Northwest Europe, and to do anything else would waste resources on what were basically just sideshows, which is a violation of the military principle of concentration. He proposed a series of operations: Bolero, Sledgehammer, and Roundup. Bolero called for the buildup of U.S. forces in the United Kingdom. Sledgehammer was a plan to land 5 divisions in France in September 1942. Ostensibly to be executed only if the Russian front collapsed, its more ardent supporters wanted to invade Europe whatever the circumstances, envisioning a lodgment to be expanded when Roundup landed 48 divisions in April 1943. On the other hand, Churchill advocated attacking the periphery, the strategy that brought success to Britain against the Bourbon and Napoleonic France. America should intervene in the Mediterranean, where Britain was already fighting the Germans in Egypt and Libya. He proposed Operation Gymnast, the invasion of French North Africa. The British submerged their antagonism for European operations in 1942 under the guise of giving all options a thorough analysis. So the conference concluded by endorsing Bolero and recommending further study for both Gymnast and Sledgehammer. Churchill is wonderfully disingenuous about their position in Hinge of Fate. The obfuscation was a source of future ill will and suspicion. Hinge of Fate is one of the volumes in Churchill's multi-volume history of World War II, a terrific read. But when he talks about other things, but this in particular, the arguments over where to go in 1942, you can see the power of his mind and how difficult it would be to argue with him because he's convinced himself that he's being perfectly frank. On the other hand, there's not a chance that they were going to go along with the U.S. plans. So disingenuous is a good word for it, I think. FDR sent Marshall and Harry Hopkins to London in April 1942 to continue the discussion. Marshall wanted a firm British commitment to invading Europe in 1942, or if not then, in 1943 for sure. He argued superior Allied air power would protect Sledgehammer while forcing substantial German diversions from the Eastern Front. The British disagreed. German power in France was far stronger than the projected invasion force and would crush it without deploying a single battalion from Russia. Trying to support 60,000 men across the English Channel through the winter was to court disaster. They also believed that after the disasters of Norway, Dunkirk, and Greece, another failed continental adventure would crush British morale. Churchill would lose his office to the appeasers, and Britain might well leave the war. No decision was reached, but the battle lines were becoming clearer. The Russian foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, visited London and Washington in May 1942. Russia had suffered 5 million casualties, absorbing the bulk of German military might, while the West had only a few tens of thousands in combat with the Nazis. Stalin demanded a second front in Europe to take the pressure off his decimated army. If Russia collapsed, 3 million German troops would be freed up to turn west. Or what if Hitler and Stalin made peace? They'd been allies in 1939 and might be again. The smaller photo here shows Molotov signing the non-aggression pact with the Nazis in late August 1939. That was the go-ahead for the invasion of Poland and the opening of the war. And of course, you can see Stalin smiling broadly, and the man just to Stalin's right is Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister. The British were non-committal to Molotov, but in Washington, FDR released a statement that full understanding was reached with regard to the urgent task of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. He had made a promise to Stalin the British had not agreed to and would not support. Churchill was worried that FDR was getting a bit off the rails and arranged for another gathering in Washington in June. The conference concluded Sledgehammer and Gymnast should be studied further, but it was obvious the British had no enthusiasm for France in 1942, and despite protests to the contrary in 1943 either. Sledgehammer would be a preponderantly British operation, so it was their decision. After the conference in July, Churchill sent a message to FDR stating, "I have found no one who regards Sledgehammer as possible. I should like to see you do Gymnast as soon as possible." That meant North Africa was the only place FDR could at least partially fulfill his promise to Stalin to fight the Germans in 1942. Against Marshall's advice, the president ordered Gymnast, now renamed Torch. After Dunkirk and Mers el-Kabir, it was expedient for Torch to have an American commander. Dwight David Eisenhower was appointed, making his debut on the world stage. Born in 1890, Ike grew up poor in Abilene, Kansas. Accepted to West Point, he graduated in the middle of the class of 1915, known as the class the stars fell on because of the number of generals that were produced. He remained stateside, training troops in World War I. He was promoted to major in 1919 and remained a major for 16 years. That typically marking the stagnation of the U.S. Army between the wars. His largest command was a battalion in the 1920s. He was principally a staff officer. He was intelligent and very hardworking. His potential surfaced when he graduated first of 245 from the Command of General Staff College in 1926. In the 1930s, he served under Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur in Washington, and again when MacArthur was a field marshal in the Philippine Army. The two men developed a certain antipathy for one another, exacerbated by conflicts after the war when Ike was Chief of Staff and MacArthur Emperor of Japan. MacArthur derided Eisenhower as the best clerk I ever had. Eisenhower responded, "I studied dramatics under MacArthur for 7 years." Ike was brilliant in the Great Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941. His commanding officer recommended Colonel Eisenhower to Marshall for his broad vision, progressive ideas, thorough grasp of the magnitude of the problem involved in handling an army. He has lots of initiative and resourcefulness. Soon after Pearl Harbor, Ike became head of Plans Department in the War Office, working directly for Marshall on some of the biggest issues of the war. The Chief of Staff thought so highly of his abilities, he sent him to London at the end of June to be U.S. theater commander and prepare U.S. forces for Sledgehammer. It was a meteoric rise. Ike went from colonel to four-star general in just a year. He was fortune's darling, in the right place at the right time. As a matter of fact, his old friend George Patton said his initials DD stood for Divine Destiny. But it was his ability that made that destiny. The political situation in French North Africa was extraordinarily complex. The quasi-independent Vichy government under Marshal Henri Pétain controlled unoccupied France, the colonial army, and the considerable French Navy. So they were not merely the pawns of the Germans. They had their own authority and their own forces. Some of the people in Vichy, like Laval, enthusiastically supported the Germans, but many, especially in the military, felt it was their patriotic duty to support the legitimate government of France, represented by Pétain. These people despised de Gaulle and his Free French as traitors. The Gaullists were equally hostile, regarding Pétain as a quisling. Their troops fought one another at Dakar, Madagascar, and in Syria. It was critical the French continue to exercise civil authority in North Africa. Otherwise, Allied forces would be consumed maintaining order amidst a hostile Arab population over thousands of square miles. Consider our experience in Iraq, if you will. The planners, Ike had no desire, Ike didn't have the troops and he didn't have the desire to undertake such a mission. The planners hoped that the French would welcome the landings as the first step in the liberation of France, and our army would be recalled as their comrades from 1917, when the expression was "Nous sommes ici, Lafayette." They hoped they would be welcomed again, but what they needed was a Frenchman with a certain stature to be what they would like to hold as a figurehead, but someone that the French forces, authorities in North Africa could legitimately respond to when he called for their cooperation with the invasion. De Gaulle didn't help matters any by his normal hauteur, which was out of all proportion to his strength. When he learned about Torch, he sent his chief of staff to see Eisenhower to inform him that de Gaulle expected to command any operations in French territory. Eisenhower looked at the man and said, "Thank you," and sent him on his way. Instead, the Allies turned to the heroic General Henri Giraud. Taken prisoner after the fall of France, he escaped and was living privately in unoccupied France. Smuggled to Gibraltar by submarine, he showed that de Gaulle had no monopoly on hauteur. Eisenhower was nonplussed when he too demanded command of Torch. Look at that expression on Ike's face. That may be an open car with wind blowing in it, but I doubt it. I think he's just, well, he's downright peeved. That's what he is. The strategic objective for Torch was to occupy the French colony of Tunisia, cut off the Africa Corps' lines of communication to Europe, and isolate the battlefield of North Africa. That's a principle of war that, unfortunately, the United States has disregarded in recent years. This had to be done quickly before the Germans could use their nearby bases in Sicily and Italy to intervene. The British wanted landings in the Mediterranean only and as far east as possible. Ironically, given our boldness over the invasion of Europe, the Americans were more cautious. They feared Franco might close the Straits of Gibraltar or attack their rear from Spanish Morocco. Marshall wanted a secure western flank, and he also wanted the major port of Casablanca for the avalanche of logistics follow-on that would follow the invasion. Again, it was his troops, and so it was his way that got done. And the Western Task Force, 34,000 strong under Major General George Patton, Jr., sailed from Norfolk, Virginia for the Atlantic coast of French Morocco, 1,000 miles from Tunis. A separate landing force sailed for Algeria from Great Britain. The Eastern Task Force, 20,000 men from the U.S. 34th Division and the British 78th, along with part of the 1st British Commando, began landing around Algiers at 0100 on November 8th. Hoping to seize the port intact, two destroyers, HMS Brooke and Malcolm, with part of the 135th Infantry embarked, approached Algiers harbor almost 3 hours later. Surprise was long gone, and they were met by heavy French naval fire. Malcolm was hit hard and withdrew. Brooke managed to get 250 men ashore before heavy fire forced her back to sea, leaving the GIs stranded and pinned down. Brooke sank the next day while under tow to Gibraltar. In contrast, the French army put up only light resistance. By noon, 2 British battalions and 2 American regimental combat teams were ashore. General Charles Mast welcomed the invaders into Fort Sidi Farouk without resistance, and shortly thereafter a ceasefire was arranged. General Alphonse Juin, at 1900 D-Day, the U.S. troops entered Algiers. Ominously, Luftwaffe planes flying out of Sicily heavily damaged a destroyer and a transport while the Germans began organizing an airlift into Tunisia. The race was on. At Oran, the target for Center Task Force, the forces were built around the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, under Major General Terrible Terry Allen. That was a nickname he picked up at West Point, where his disdain for authority was renowned. The 1st Ranger Battalion, under the soon-to-be legendary Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, seized the small port of Arzew. The Rangers led the way for Allen's 16th and 18th Infantry Regiments, supported by tanks from the 1st Armored Division. Meanwhile, the 26th Regiment, accompanied by the Assistant Divisional Commander, Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son and namesake of the President, came ashore west of Oran to little opposition. Unloading was soon in full swing at all the beaches, and by nightfall, Allen had advanced 20 miles towards Oran, while Roosevelt had the 26th Infantry atop the hills of the Jebel Merjaj and at Ain el-Turk. A little digression here about polo. In his day, Terry Allen was one of the top polo players in the Army. The Army was very much in favor of polo playing for their officers because it was a physically demanding, fiercely aggressive, and dangerous sport, and so built the sort of character you would like to see in an officer. This is much like the British Army and its enthusiasm over hunting, by which they meant chasing foxes on horseback across the countryside. The careers of both hunters in England and polo players in the U.S. Army prospered. This is George Patton at the age of 41 playing polo in Honolulu. And I think you can get an idea. I mean, the fitness, look what he's got control of the pony. He's leaned out like this. I believe he's going to hit the ball backwards. It's quite an athletic display. And he was quite an athlete, of course. In Oran and nearby Mers el-Kabir, the French Navy again fought hard. HMS Walney and Heartland, carrying a U.S. infantry landing party, were off the harbor mouth 2 hours after the other landings. Again, surprised with loss, a massacre ensued. Caught in French searchlights under fire, Walney broke through the boom but was raked at point-blank range by the French sloop Surprise. Other ships joined in, reducing Walney to a blazing hulk, her decks a shambles, adrift with her engines destroyed. She rolled over and sank early in the morning watch. Heartland was hit before she even entered harbor, then blasted by the guns of the French destroyer Typhon. She dropped anchor on fire from stem to stern, with hardly a man not killed or wounded, and blew up at daylight. Of 393 soldiers on the two ships, 189 were killed and 157 wounded, a 90% casualty rate. There were over 210 sailors who were also casualties. Full of fight, French warships put to sea to attack the Allied shipping, but were sunk or driven back into harbor by heavier Royal Navy ships and planes from the American escort carrier Biter. The next day, the Big Red One overcame stiff resistance at Saint-Cloud to continue the advance. Allied planes brought in from Gibraltar flew from newly seized local airfields to break up French counterattacks. A general assault on Oran began the morning of D+2, accompanied by naval gunfire and air support. The city surrendered at noon. In Morocco, U.S. troops came ashore at 3 localities: Safi in the south, Casablanca in the center, and Port Lyautey in the north. The objective at Safi was to get 54 medium tanks ashore and drive them to Casablanca by the end of D-Day. Some French opposition and the usual difficulties of moving tanks and men from ship to shore delayed the advance until November 10th, D+2. The column traveled through the night to get within 50 miles of Casablanca when resistance ended throughout French Morocco on the morning of November 11th. There was harder fighting in the north, where Major General Lucien Truscott, another top polo player, commanded the 60th Infantry Regiment and an armored battalion, 9,000 men in all. Their D-Day objective was to seize the all-weather airfield at Port Lyautey, then fly in P-40 Tomahawk fighters from Gibraltar and the carrier Chenango just offshore. It was another wildly optimistic time frame. The ships carrying the first assault wave didn't have enough landing craft to carry all the troops, so boats from other transports were needed to carry the rest of the wave. Around midnight on D-Day, the amphibious force lost formation, approaching the anchorage, and confusion reigned as landing craft searched for their assigned transport in the midwatch under a new moon. You can imagine it's difficult enough trying to get from point A to point B at night, and suddenly the ship that you were expecting to be right over there at 2,000 yards isn't there. All you have are these gray hulks. Where are we supposed to go? H-hour was postponed twice. Several small French vessels managed to pass through the formation and signal the shore. The landings in Algeria were hours earlier, as were broadcasts from FDR and Ike appealing to the French to join their liberators. So again, surprise was lost. Two-thirds of the infantry missed their assigned beaches and had to advance over formidable terrain. Here the French felt honor-bound to fight. There was heavy combat around the Casbah, an old French fort blocking the Cebu River and the advance to the airport. Truscott came ashore in the early afternoon, roaming the beach in a half-track with a radio and kicking butt, as he called it. He committed his only organized reserve, a single company of infantry, to reinforce the stalled drive against the Casbah, and organized ad hoc forces from stragglers on the beach to shore up his defenses elsewhere. The winds came up at sunset. The surf rose to 15 feet, crashing thunderously on the beach. Fire from coastal batteries drove the transports further offshore, making a longer trip for the boats through difficult waters, followed then by a dangerous and often destructive effort to land on the beach. The official history calls the situation insecure and precarious. French reinforcements on D-Day on D+1, coming from Fez and Meknes, counterattacked at dawn. They threatened to drive the 2nd Battalion into the sea and split the regiment in half. Although forced back, the American line held at the bluffs above the beach. That's this attack, the red arrow, coming in here. And you can see there's not much what we call depth to that defensive position. Truscott's light tanks and the Regimental Cannon Company halted another French attack on the southern flank. Then salvos from USS Savannah forced the French back, and the GIs took the offensive. More naval gunfire plus field artillery and tanks broke up enemy defenses on the hills in front of Port Lyautey. That's about here. But before they could resume the attack, 2 naval friendly fire incidents disorganized the battalion. It couldn't advance until the next morning, when they found French resistance dwindling from fatigue and the uncertain political situation. 2 regiments of Moroccan tirailleurs surrendered. At dawn on D+2, the USS Dallas forced the boom across the Cebu River while under fire from the Casbah, then grounded opposite the airfield and sent a raider detachment ashore in rubber boats. By noon, the airfield and the city of Port Lyautey were in American hands, and the much longed-for P-40s flown in. The Casbah fell to the 2nd Battalion, with Colonel Frederick de Rohan, Truscott's second-in-command, personally leading the assault. Driven back twice by heavy machine gun fire, Navy dive bombers were called in. While the smoke and dust from the bombs still hung in the air, the Yanks made their 3rd charge. The garrison of 250 had enough and surrendered. And you can see what a strong position this would be. Look at that bluff And that might be, 16th or 17th century masonry, but it's still quite proof against small arms fire, and you have the high ground. At 2250 on D+2, General Maurice Mathenet requested a local ceasefire from General Truscott. The battle was over at 0400 November 11th. Meanwhile, the main landings were taking place at Casablanca, a city well defended by infantry, artillery, and substantial naval forces, including the battleship Jean Bart, immobile but with 4 working 15-inch guns. To avoid a costly frontal assault and damaging the vital port infrastructure, the 3rd Infantry Division and an armored battalion came ashore at the Bay of Fadala, 10 miles north of the city. The landing beaches were dangerously exposed to high surf and enfilade fire from coastal artillery. As at Port Lyautey, there was confusion and delay. Boats landed miles off target, often on rocks and shoals. Men loaded down with equipment drowned in the water, while the survivors were cut and battered without weapons or radios that they needed to fight. Nonetheless, the Americans quickly organized and advanced. Some of the French garrison fought, and some didn't. With timely naval gunfire support, the division reached its D-Day objective by 2400 with only moderate losses. Among the ships firing in their support was the light cruiser Brooklyn, with Lieutenant Commander Samuel Eliot Morrison aboard. When war broke out, Morrison, a renowned history professor at Harvard, asked his friend Franklin Roosevelt for a commission as a naval historian. Now he was researching his monumental history of U.S. naval operations in World War II at the point of the spear. The seas were treacherous. Out of 58 boats launched from the transports Jefferson and Carroll on the first day, 34 were lost and 11 more damaged, 75% attrition. By D+2, 185 boats were stranded along the beaches, severely delaying the ship-to-shore movement. Nevertheless, supplies piled up on the wharves and beaches because there were no vehicles to bring them forward and no organization dedicated to the task. The operational decision was made for Olive Torch to maximize combat troops and initial fighting power, deferring support troops and equipment. The 7th and 15th Regiments resumed the advance on D+1, but halted after only 4 miles to bring up artillery, transportation, and communications equipment, foreshadowing problems getting to Tunisia. This is Patton aboard the Augusta. He crossed the Atlantic on Admiral Hewitt, the task force commander's flagship, Augusta. And I've got to point this out. Look at that uniform. I mean, it's just magnificent. And if you can see his shoes, what a great shine on those shoes. My first billet was on a Rear Admiral staff, and I remember he had the most beautifully shined shoes. He had about 5 stewards to take care of his mess and his needs and so forth. Beautiful shine, and that one looks pretty good as well. Patton was delayed getting ashore D-Day when the Augusta's rear 8-inch turret fired on French warships coming out of harbor. It blew his boat off the davits and into the water, where it promptly sank. He lost almost all his personal gear, although his pistols, fortunately, were not on the boat, so he got to keep those. Patton didn't reach Fadala until 1320 and spent the night there. He was up before daylight on D+1, went to the beach where he observed that the situation was a mess, with leadership negligent. The men were poor, the officers worse, he held. He went to work in typical Patton style. This is a quote from the book by his aide, Codman. He jumped into the water and shouted at some nearby soldiers, "Come back here. Yes, I mean you, all of you. Drop that stuff and come back here. Faster than that, goddammit, on the double." Waist deep in water and with his shoulder against the bow of the landing craft, Patton showed them what he wanted done. He yelled for them to wait the next wave. "Lift and push now. Push, goddammit, push. Don't you realize that boat has other trips to make? How do you expect to fight a war without ammunition? Now go and take that stuff up to the dump, on the double." Coming on a scared soldier lying in the sand sobbing, Patton wrote, "He kicked him in the fanny with all my might, and he jumped right up and went to work." some way to boost morale. I hit another man who was too lazy to push a boat. He worked on the beach tirelessly without food or water until returning to the Augusta that afternoon to confer with Hewitt. Meanwhile, a naval battle was going on. As the sun rose on D-Day, Jean Bart and the battery Al Haik in Casablanca harbor opened up. The battleship Massachusetts returned fire and quickly knocked out Jean Bart. The coastal batteries were silenced, but resumed shooting as the opportunity presented it. 7 French destroyers sortied at 0830 to attack the transports, but fire from Augusta, Brooklyn, and their escorts drove them back to harbor. In a second attack, a French destroyer leader was sunk and the cruiser Primauguet badly damaged and forced to beach. By the end of the day, French surface ships were no longer a factor, though submarines, both French and German, remained a threat. There was heavy fighting on D+2. The 7th Infantry closed on Casablanca from the east, while the 15th approached from the south. Advancing through prepared defenses against artillery, heavy rifle, and machine gun fire, they suffered 150 casualties and fell 10 hours behind schedule. With more than 4,000 French troops and 90 guns defending Casablanca, the battle for the city was sure to be bloody. Mercifully, late that afternoon, General Auguste Noguet, commanding French troops in Morocco, learned Admiral François Darlan, C&C of the French Armed Forces and Pétain's designated successor, had issued orders to end the fighting. Nogues arranged for a ceasefire. By coincidence, Darlan was in Algiers on D-Day. As we have seen, everyone placed the highest priority on French cooperation. Darlan embodied the de jure government of France and so commanded the loyalty of French authorities throughout Africa. Claiming to act on a secret understanding with Pétain, he negotiated an armistice with Mark Clark. The Darlan deal, as it became known, produced a political firestorm. Frenchmen who rose in support of the invasion remained in prison awaiting trial for treason, while the authorities continued their anti-Semitic practices of the Vichy government, all now with the de facto approval of Britain and the United States. Liberal opinion was appalled. When the time came, would we support the other quisling governments of occupied Europe? This is Darlan saluting Hitler at Berchtesgaden. That's what you call bad optics. Ike, who should have been focused on a speedy advance into Tunisia, was consumed in the politics, but showed his mettle in standing up to his masters. He wrote the combined chiefs of staff on November 14 that the idea of French affection for Americans would overpower their sense of loyalty to their legally constituted government or take orders from the figurehead Giraud was self-deceptive. The French stopped fighting because Darlan, as their legitimate leader, told them to. They would obey no one else. No one, not on the ground, could appreciate the complex currents of feeling and of prejudice that influenced the situation. Mighty strong words to write to your bosses. But they impressed FDR, particularly with Eisenhower's political acumen. He understood the political situation in North Africa, and he dealt with it. FDR masterfully diffused the situation by publicly declaring no one would decide the future of France but the French people after they were liberated. There was no binding agreement for the future. Darlan, no fool, remarked that FDR wished to squeeze him like a lemon and throw him away when the juice was gone. Although I'm no apologist for Vichy, I think it is worth reflecting on what the difficulties were of the situation for Frenchmen who remained loyal in 1940. They had sworn an oath to the government. Pétain was the legitimate government. You could, what was a man of honor to do? And you could come down on either side of this debate, I believe. Well, the race was still on for Tunisia. Remember, that was our objective, to build up in Tunisia and seize those ports there before the Nazis could make their presence felt. By December of 1942, 180,000 U.S. troops were in North Africa, but only 12,000 in Tunisia. Together with 20,000 British, they formed the First Army under British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson. There were 30,000 ill-equipped French that were more or less with them, and they faced 56,000 Axis troops, including 2 German divisions. To capture the vital port of Tunis, Anderson needed to take the Jebel el Amara, which the British called Longstop Hill. If I may, this was the advance, this was where the Allied position was in Tunisia, and at Medjel el Bab was the base. Here's Longstop, and here is Tunis, where they wanted to get, and here's the 10th Panzer Division. So they needed Longstop Hill, as the British called it, Jebel el Amara. There was also a second hill to the northeast, the Jebel el Rar, separated from Amara by a mere ravine. Both had to be taken to secure the position. They were clearly marked on Allied maps, and troops were there, Allied troops were there the previous month. Unfortunately, the British failed to realize the tactical importance of the terrain feature. Intelligence reported Longstop was held by a single company. 2 German battalions were actually in the area. 4 companies of the Coldstream Guards marched 6 miles from Medjel el Bab to attack shortly before midnight on December 23rd. After some sharp fighting, they took the crest and halted, awaiting relief by the 1st Battalion of the U.S. 18th Infantry, part of the Big Red One. The Guards ignored counterattacks that drove back their right flank as a cold rain began to fall. Rick Atkinson writes in An Army at Dawn, "The relief in combat of one battalion by another is difficult for kindred units in daylight and fine weather. Between strangers of different nationalities at night in a downpour, the task is infinitely harder. The British guides either missed the Americans completely or were uncertain where they should go. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert York, lost his way and was pinned down by enemy machine gun fire. He eventually stumbled into the Coldstream command post while his staff was still wandering the night, and 800 of his infantrymen were scattered across the hill. At 4:30 a.m., their duty done as they defined it, the Coldstreams decamped, in squelching boots, sleepless and hungry. With the dawn, the Americans realized their peril. Half the hillside was in enemy hands. Prisoners told Colonel York that rather than a handful of soldiers, a battalion of Panzer Grenadiers was on the hills with reinforcements en route. The ensuing German attack cut off and destroyed Company A on the right flank. Only 14 men escaped death or capture. Artillery and mortars raked the Yanks. Supporting British artillery fire was sporadic and ineffective. By 1500, the Americans were barely clinging to the lower reaches of the hill. The only reinforcements available were the Coldstream Guards. You can imagine the indignation of the Guardsmen as they trudged in the mud and rain back over those 6 miles that they'd already hiked twice in the last 24 hours, and their contempt for the inept Americans, unable to hold a position that was handed to them. The battle resumed on Christmas Eve with heavy casualties on both sides. At dawn on Christmas Day, the German regimental commander, Colonel Rudolf Lang, led a company of tanks with artillery support in a desperate attack that drove in both flanks and forced the Allies to abandon Longstop. In 3 days of fighting, British casualties were 178. Americans' casualties were twice as great, with 40% of the 1st Battalion lost. The Guards Brigade after-action report excoriated the 18th Infantry. It said, the plain facts are that the Americans did not retain possession of the key points and did not really make a major effort to get them back. They were unfitted and unprepared for the task, close quote. British soldiers started calling Americans our Italians. On hearing of Longstop and the rebuke to his men, Terry Allen exploded. He had been forced to remain idle while his division was broken up and spread across Tunisia under British command, just what Pershing fought against in World War I. Many American officers bitterly criticized Ike for doing that. An extraordinarily pugnacious man, Allen stormed into the office of Beadle Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, and demanded, "Is this a private war, or can anybody get in?" Permission was granted to go to the front. A decorated combat veteran in World War I, Allen knew what had to be done in battle. After a thorough analysis, he concluded the British completely misused his men. He confronted the British Corps commander, Lieutenant General Charles Alfrey, with a written report accompanied by astringent observations, his own astringent observations on British failures, neglecting to properly guide the Americans to the front, lack of a proper turnover briefing, abandoning the men in poorly prepared positions to figure out the situation in the dark, and deficient artillery support when the Germans struck. Alfrey was desperate. If Allen presented his findings to Allied headquarters, the crisis would rock the coalition. Alfrey asked what he intended. Looking him in the eye, Allen tore the report in two, saying, "I hope this will be a lesson to the British High Command in how to deal with Americans. I expect that if I get any British troops under my command, I'll give them a lot better treatment than you have given my men." At dawn on December 23rd, following direct orders from George Marshall to forget the politics and focus on the battle in Tunisia, Eisenhower set off for the front in his armored Cadillac. A 300-mile trip. Now, remember, it's cold, it's raining. These are North African roads, hardly interstates, and that is a 1940 or so Cadillac limousine with all the joys and limitations of such a vehicle. On the way forward, Eisenhower watched some soldiers struggle and fail to free a motorcycle from the mire, then need help to get themselves out. He got some trucks and some tanks to go off the road to see how the ground was, and they couldn't get out either. It was obviously, it was just an impossible situation, and the advance could not be continued. He called off the offensive at that time. He finally arrived at First Army headquarters to learn Darlan had been assassinated, and immediately undertook the exhausting drive back to Algiers. Torch was over. Even before Longstop, the British had a certain contempt for American soldiers. Observing a major U.S. Army exercise a few months earlier, Sir Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, thought the Americans had much to learn. Another general remarked, "It would be murder to put the young men against trained Continental troops." As the recipients of a cornucopia of aid from America, indebtedness bred contempt, and British aristocrats were masters of contempt. Harold Macmillan, Churchill's liaison, or spy, at Eisenhower's headquarters, described Americans as great, big, vulgar, vigorous but idle, with unspoiled virtues but corrupt. Brooke, a brilliant general with a fine combat record and a lightning-quick mind, was an Anglo-Irish patrician who did not suffer fools gladly. Condescension came naturally to such men and was too often apparent. A very great deal of Eisenhower's focus was on politics, but it was unavoidable. As Allied commander, he was responsible to both London and Washington. Churchill and Roosevelt communicated directly with him, and Eisenhower himself had to respond to them as well as the combined chiefs of staff. The stress was enormous. He was never without a lit cigarette. Ike was one of the great smokers of all time. He usually lit one cigarette from another and had the appalling habit of dropping ashes and cigarette butts all over the furniture and the carpet. While still a somewhat obscure major general, he visited Montgomery's headquarters in England, smoking as usual. Monty rudely told this new Yank, "I do not permit smoking in my headquarters," and forced him to stop. It was the first of many unpleasant encounters between them. And then, of course, Eisenhower had to deal with the French. Nowadays, common wisdom extols the need for allies, but history is not so positive. Alliances are intrinsically impervious to unified command, shot through with inherent friction as the parties pursue their own national goals. Clemenceau, Premier of France at the end of World War I, said, "Since this war, my admiration for Napoleon has declined. He had only to fight coalitions." Eisenhower was not a great battlefield commander, but he was a great coalition commander, perhaps a rarer talent. That's all I have to say. Be happy to take some questions. Thank you. Yes, John.
Well, this was in this early campaign. What lessons did we learn, and how were they implemented that we learned from this?
Well, I would say we learned more in the Tunisian campaign than here, because there wasn't a great deal of hard fighting. Longstop Hill was a bad battle, but the French, they didn't have their heart in it, and so that was kind of a laydown. It's one of the reasons I didn't talk more about the battles in particular here. At Tunisia, I believe, is where we found out who knew how to do the job and who didn't. And such men as Lloyd Friedendahl were fired, and George Patton really comes into his own, as well as men like Truscott and Terry Allen. And by coincidence, I'm going to be speaking on Tunisia in June. So if you come to that, I think the lessons become clearer for us in Tunisia. Yes, Fred.
You had talked about the incident in Oran in the beginning of the war when Churchill confronted the...
Mirza Kabir.
And when was that? And was the Jean Bart, had that come from that had escaped from that incident?
No. Jean Bart, I think, escaped from metropolitan France. I'd have to research that. But Mirza Kabir comes, I want to say, a couple of weeks after the surrender of France in June. I have spoken on it, but I don't have the date on the top of my head. And it was another massacre. The British fleet sailed in, shot up the French. There were 1,500 French dead, and sailed away. It got mixed reviews. Some thought it was particularly bloodthirsty, which of course it was. But it convinced a lot of people that the British meant business, that they weren't going to surrender like the French, and they intended to fight. And in that regard, it got a very good press in the United States. Yes, sir.
I don't remember your words, but it was kind of a side thing about Northern Africa and today's world, how that should be handled or something.
Oh, well, I don't necessarily mean to recommend current policy, but the French were the colonial power in North Africa. This was why the Allies were so desperate to get French cooperation, because if the French just backed off and said, okay, it's yours now, then the Allies would have to administer a hostile population of several million Arabs who didn't particularly want to be administered to over this vast area. So it was important to get French cooperation, and that was an objective from the beginning. Have I answered your question?
I'm not really sure how that applies to today.
Well, I was thinking of Iraq. In other words, in Iraq, we did break apart the local authority. It didn't exist after Tommy Franks was finished with them, and we wound up administering Iraq for many, many years, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective. Yes. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
How much of the French fleet survived, and did we use those ships, whatever ships survived?
Well, actually, when Darlan made his deal with the Allies, the Germans responded by occupying the rest of unoccupied France, and the French fleet at Toulon, which was the main naval base, scuttled itself. This was the French had said since before the start of the war they would not allow their fleet to fall into German hands, and had given various assurances to the British before the surrender. It turns out that they were serious about this, and after taking over unoccupied France, when the Germans tried to take the French fleet, it scuttled. Now, there were ships overseas, Richelieu, which is a sister ship of the Jean Bart, and both of them were put into service and saw service before the end of the war. But a great deal of the French fleet was on the bottom at Toulon. Yes, John.
This may not be limited to this operation, but Thomas Ricks recently said that the difference between George Marshall's army and our army in World War II and what we have now is that Marshall was willing to fire people if they didn't work out, whereas people are given a pass now in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I heard him say that on the radio. I'm not, I don't know. I don't know. It's a different world. It's a different world. All institutions have their problems. Lloyd Friedendahl, who I mentioned, gets relieved after Kasserine Pass. He goes back to the United States, and Marshall gives him like a corps command in the United States. He doesn't go back to war, but he's hardly broken. On the other hand, Marshall could be terribly ruthless, and there was a case, just as the war was starting, or actually just before we got involved in it, Marshall was determined to root out all the deadwood amongst the American officer corps. As I mentioned, Eisenhower had been a major for 16 years, so there were a lot of like 58-year-old lieutenant colonels and guys who were just physically no longer capable of doing it. There were also those who were not emotionally or morally suited to it either, and he fired lots of them, many of whom were his friends, who he had, and they thought he was their friend because he'd served with them since the Philippine campaign right after the turn of the century. And one woman, they were very good friends, and she said, Marshall, he ruined my husband. He ruined his life because he fired him. Marshall, they called some colonel or other who they said, well, we're going to make you general, and we need you to get to this division overseas. You have to leave right away. And he said, oh, I can't do that. I have to arrange my furniture and all that stuff. And Marshall himself called him the next day and said, I'm sorry, you're retiring tomorrow. So he was pretty starchy guy. I mean, you look at him, he doesn't look like he's full of laughs and jollies, although his biographer, Pogue, does claim that in private he was, could be quite convivial. But that's in private, and none of it shows up much in public. Anyone else?
So I hate to ask somebody. Go ahead.
So what happened in the immediate aftermath? It sounds like
Really?
the immediate aftermath. I mean, it sounds like Tunis.
They sit for about 2 months. The mud just prohibits movement. All the logistics that they couldn't bring up because they didn't have the right forces to handle that, they slowly bring up, and the war resumes in February or so with one of the great defeats in American history at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, which, again, I'm going to talk about in June. So you have to come in June to get the next part of the story. Yes.
Foreshadowing.
Yes.
Is that me?
Yes.
In looking at some personal history, I realized that my father's destroyer in May of 1945 was coming back from an escort from Oran to the East Coast. What were we still doing over there in that time?
They had air bases in North Africa until the end of the war, because you could fly from there. The raids against Ploesti, I believe, originated in North Africa, and those were 1943-44. And also we continued to fight in Italy till the end of the war. And so the logistics to go to Italy, I imagine, a lot of them would go through North Africa first, although I'd have to get back to you on that. I haven't done the Italian campaign yet. Yes, sir.
How did a VMI graduate get in control of all those West Point generals?
He was.
That wasn't easy.
No, he was very good, though. He was on Pershing's staff in the First World War. I mean, he was a brilliant man. He was
Clearly.
at VMI, of course. Patton actually graduated from West Point, but he had attended VMI as well. But you're right; it is somewhat remarkable that.
Amazing.
Yeah, but he was a great. I mean, couldn't have done it without him.
Yeah.
Great man.
The surviving French ships, how did they get to the Allies? They just turned themselves in, or what?
Yeah. When Darlan says stop fighting, and then the Navy, they all lay down their arms, and those ships are now available after some negotiations and so on and so forth. And Jean Bart does come back before the end of the war and fights on our side, as does the Richelieu and various other French units. Yes, well,
Nice. There's time for one more. I'm a little unclear about Darlan's motivations, and what do we know about his assassination, and how does that?
He's assassinated by a royalist, actually. A royalist.
Royalist?
Yes, yes. There's still French royalists at this time. And gosh, how a royalist in particular came to assassinate him, I'm not entirely sure. I didn't study that much. And they execute the guy almost immediately. It's one of those deals where they didn't want to know who he had been talking to. It's a wonderfully complex situation that Darlan finds himself in, and depending on your perspective, he's the noblest Frenchman of them all. I mean, he's trying to support his country under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, or else he's a little popinjay toady to the Nazis. There's a boy, I can't remember the name of the book offhand. If you email me, I'll give you the name of it. But a fellow who's very, very sympathetic to Darlan, and it's very eye-opening because I think we tend to take the view of Vichy that they were simply toadies to the Nazis, and it was a more complicated world than that. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.